Mark of the Beast, Part 14. All in the Mind. Fabian Society member Bertrand Russell bravely gives away his mind control plan for his new world in The Impact of Science on Society. He says, quote, "Diet, injections, and injunctions will combine from a very early age to produce the sort of character and the sort of beliefs that the authorities consider desirable. And any serious criticism of the powers that be will become psychologically impossible. Even if they are miserable, all will believe themselves happy, because the government will tell them that they are so." Bertrand Russell looked forward to seeing how far the social engineers would be able to deceive people in the future using scientific methods. Quote, "It may be hoped that in time anybody will be able to persuade anybody of anything if he can catch the patient young and is provided by the state with money and equipment." Quote, "The subject will make great strides when it is taken up by scientists under a scientific dictatorship. The social psychologists of the future will have a number of classes of school children on whom they will try different methods of producing an unshakable conviction that snow is black. Various results will soon be arrived at. First, that the influence of home is obstructive. Second, that not much can be done unless indoctrination begins before the age of 10. Third, that verses set to music and repeatedly intoned are very effective. Fourth, that the opinion that snow is white must be held to show a morbid taste for eccentricity. Although this science will be diligently studied, it will be rigidly confined to the governing class. The populace will not be allowed to know how its convictions were generated. When the technique has been perfected, every government that has been in charge of education for a generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen. As we will see, controlling the population with ignorance and with brainwashing is really where it's at for idol pushers who want to enact the mark of the beast. This was well studied and preached by people like Edward Bernays, who wrote the book on propaganda. No, literally, he wrote the book called Propaganda. And he had this to say: "Propaganda is the executive arm of the invisible government." As is evident from their writings, creating the new normal for these people means establishing one world and one religion through establishing one mind. The goal of these anti-Christian idol pushers like Bertrand Russell and H.G. Wells is to shatter the influence of the home and to set up a scientific dictatorship so that at an early age, uniform state indoctrination can control its subjects' minds without their knowledge. In another book of his, entitled Power, A New Social Analysis, Russell sees Christianity's motto, "Obey God rather than man," as an obstacle to a benevolent scientific dictatorship. And he even mentions non-political Christian groups like the Christadelphians by name. The idle pushers who want a great reset and a benevolent scientific dictatorship have always considered the home and religion as number one public enemies to their world peace. The first director of the United Nations World Health Organization had this to say about what he called the poison influence of parents and Sunday school. Quote, "We have swallowed all manner of poisonous certainties fed us by our parents, our Sunday and day school teachers, and others with a vested interest in controlling us." Anyone familiar with the writings of United Nations educators know that getting children away from parents and church is high on their agenda. Brock Chisolm also said, "To achieve world government, it's necessary to remove from the minds of men their individualism, loyalty to family tradition, national patriotism, and religious dogmas." The Bible warns us that powerful deception will be ubiquitous in the last days. Quote, "For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if it were possible, they shall even deceive the elect." And these last days, idol pushers aren't going to be nice about it. Again, from Matthew 24. "Then they will hand you over to be tortured, and will put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. Then many will fall away, and they will betray one another, and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray." It's very possible that these verses are not about a bearded, robed, fake Messiah claiming to be Jesus. Perhaps these verses are about the powerful institutions, worldwide nations, which offer a false utopian kingdom on the earth instead of Christ. Some might say, what do I care about what Bertrand Russell or H.G. Wells, the Fabian socialists, have to say about getting in my mind and controlling my thoughts? But UNESCO, a very powerful, very influential group, talks about the same ideas as those Fabian socialists in UNESCO, its purpose and philosophy, when they say, "The subject will be of most importance politically is mass psychology, or brainwashing. Its importance has been enormously increased by the growth of modern methods of propaganda. Of these, the most influential is what is called education, the press, the cinema, and the radio play an increasing part." Apparently, for wannabe world controllers, propaganda is nothing personal. It's just business. It's just another necessary tool in their toolbox. They say, quote, "Every country has now woken up to the need, in our complex modern world, of public relations, which is but a new name for propaganda. That term, which unhappily has grown tarnished through misuse. In a world which must be planned, governments must often assume initiative and leadership. And for this leadership to be effective, the general public must be informed of the problem and of what is in the government's mind. This is the essential function of public relations in the modern state. Propaganda, or PR, public relations, just makes good sense when you are hypnotizing nations under the banner of world peace. According to the UN, the struggle for world unification takes place in the mind, and the mind is its primary target. Quote, "It is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed." It goes on to say that ignorance of each other's ways, suspicion and mistrust, and differences have all too often broken into war. As Bible students, we know that differences and suspicion and mistrust is exactly what a merciful Elohim gave mankind at the Tower of Babel in order to save him from the collective suicide and mass genocide that comes with centralized absolute power. God made men misunderstand and mistrust each other on purpose through language confusion in order to prevent catastrophes like democide. It is estimated that 5 times more people have been murdered by their own governments, democide, than have been killed in war. In Genesis chapter 9, we see that God and his angels created nationhood on purpose in order to avert the disaster of democide. This is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they have a mind to do will be impossible for them. Come on, let's go down there and confuse their language so that they won't understand each other's speech. Genesis chapter 11. UNESCO, however, laments this divine intervention, and they are intent on a modern rebuilding of the Tower of Babel. They say on page 13 that they must envisage some form of world political unity, whether through a single world government or otherwise. They want to educate people about the implications of the transfer of full sovereignty from separate nations to a world organization. They want to lay the foundations on which world political unity can later be built. They want political unification in some sort of world government. And to do this, they know that they need to work on the unification in the things of the mind and to direct men's thoughts. For them, an international amends must take place, and this will be done by enacting uniformity and sameness across the world. Quote, "Unifying of traditions in a single common pool of experience, awareness, and purpose is the necessary prerequisite for further major progress in human evolution." End quote. Accordingly, although political unification in some sort of world government will be required for the definitive attainment of this stage, Unification in the things of the mind is not only also necessary, but can pave the way for other types of unification. Through their own words, we see that their quest to centralize power is not to be done through war in the physical sense of military prowess, but through their propaganda, through their influence, and through the downright hijacking of the mind. Nonetheless, if you look at things like State Department Memorandum 7277, they will still depend on armaments and guns. Their motto isn't to beat their spears into plowshares, as they say. It is, give us your spears, as we see in this document shown that the UN will gradually take all of the armaments away from other countries until other countries have no arms, their citizens have no arms, and the UN has all of the weapons. During our time period, we are in a psychic war, an information war, as Ephesians chapter 6 puts it. We are not contending against flesh and blood, but against the principalities, against the powers, against the world rulers of this present darkness, against the spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. And understand that even if you choose not to contend against the world rulers of this present darkness, understand that they are contending against you. If you are a fundamentalist Christian or someone who questions their group think, UNESCO feels that they must wage a propaganda war on what they call anti-science movements. Quote, we must offer increasing resistance to the forces making for division and conflict. So people that are resisting the uniformity and sameness. Page 37 says, thus it cannot and must not tolerate the blocking of research or the hampering of its application by superstition or theological prejudice. It must regard, or if necessary, oppose unscientific or anti-scientific movements, such as anti-vivisectionism, fundamentalism, belief in miracles, crude spiritualism, etc. In order to do this effectively, widespread popular education is required. Thus, mass campaigns against illiteracy for a common fundamental education must form part of UNESCO's program. Popular understanding of science. The war against fundamentalists, the war against spiritualists, the war against anyone who questions their quote-unquote science is faced with degradation and ridicule, usually by the culture, the late-night comedians, the cartoons, the films, Hollywood, television, the mass media. And we see this tool to be used against anti-science movements was there from the start. Reading again from UNESCO's plan and purpose, quote, it is clear that UNESCO must concern itself with the arts as indispensable agents. And they're going to use that to fight against not only anti-science, but cultural backwardism. So again, traditions, beliefs, things that people do that they consider anti-science. They said that they're going to use all means of communication, films, and radio programs. This will be the latest part of the task of unifying the world mind, and that they will concern themselves with the spread of information through all media of mass communication. In other words, the press, the cinema, the radio, and television, end quote. And we certainly see that in our world today. UNESCO realized from the start that through film and radio and art, they could do something that was impossible to do with just presenting people with books and with information and with facts. They know that it is important to get an emotional response, and that emotional response to their propaganda can best be gotten through television and film. Quote, art is necessary as part of the technique, since for most people, art alone can effectively express the intangibles and add the driving force of emotion to the cold facts of information. It is the artist alone in whose hands truth becomes impressive. Perhaps because it is the art of drama which is most essential in bringing life to the issues of everyday life, but that art can, of course, operate elsewhere than on the stage, most notably on the films. Whatever the details, it remains true that one of the social functions of art is to make men feel their destiny, and to obtain a full comprehension, emotional as well as intellectual, of their tasks in life and their role in the community. Rightfully used, it is one of the essential agencies for mobilizing society for action. Not only will they use the arts and film and radio and television to get their message across without you knowing it, they also hint at the idea of using subconscious or subliminal techniques. It says that nor is any other agency than UNESCO concerning itself with such important applications of the sciences as the disciplining of the mind to produce so-called mystical experience and other high degrees of spiritual satisfaction, or with the application of psychology to the technique of government. It also says that the importance of psychology to every branch of social science, as well, of course, as to education. Admittedly, both deep analytical psychology and social psychology are in their infancy, but the one is revealing in the unconscious a new world just as unexpected and as important as that new world of the invisible revealed by the microscopists of the 17th century. As we said before, Julian Huxley was a Fabian socialist who believed in social engineering to be used to create world government. Getting inside your mind and making you act, speak, and think in a uniform fashion that shows strict obedience to the government is the mission of his group and of today's globalists. Around the same time that Huxley wrote UNESCO, Purpose and Philosophy, George Orwell wrote his book 1984 to warn us that it is your mind that they are after. Is it a coincidence that everything George Orwell warned us about in 1984 is coming true? On page 1 in the second paragraph, we are already greeted with something that echoes our day today. Quote, at present, the electric current was cut off during daylight hours. It was part of the economy drive. The intelligent character in the book, it says this about her. She didn't care much for reading. Books were just a commodity, like jam or bootlaces. In describing the common people, or the proles, the proletariat, in 1984, Orwell says this about them. Films, football, beer, and gambling filled up their minds. They could only focus on petty grievances. The larger evils escaped their notice. The lottery was the principal, if not the only reason, for remaining alive. Orwell's description of their mass media reminds us of ours today. Quote, newspapers containing almost nothing except sport, crime, and astrology. Films oozing with sex. And sentimental songs which were composed entirely by mechanical means. In 1984, Orwell says that three things control the world: the Ministry of Plenty, which is our Federal Reserve, the Ministry of Peace, which is our Defense Department, the military industrial complex, and the Ministry of Truth, which is our media. Orwell and Huxley knew the value of having thousands of opinions when it comes to media. They were appalled even in the 1960s that there was only maybe 5 to 10,000 sources of news out there. They would be rolling over in their grave to learn that we were down to 6 media sources in our day and age. In 1984, the culture and the media wage war on freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of thought. These are vilified as things only the scumbags of society would want to practice. In 1984, war is done to achieve peace. Freedom is gotten through submission, and ignorance is strength. We are actually seeing this in our day when big news stories are coming out telling us that we must not do our own research when it comes to science, that we must trust the popular science, we must trust the party line, and what is good for the collective and what is good for society is good for us, the individual. Some of the subjects in 1984 that echo our day are almost eerie. For example, the morning jerks, which the main character Winston has to face each morning, where the government makes sure that you're doing your morning exercises. This is reminiscent of our Fitbits and the way in which these devices are now being incorporated into our jobs so that our employers and the government, who wants to provide us with health care, are going to watch over us and make sure that we're making the right decisions and doing the right exercising. The idea of face crime coming true in our day and age in the social media. Face crime is when you have an inappropriate expression. To wear an improper expression on your face To look incredulous when a victory was announced, for example, was itself a punishable offense. There was even a word for it in newspeak. Face crime, it was called. Unpersoned Individuals in 1984 reminds us of those people who have been banned from social media and no longer exist. We are told that the party could thrust its hand into the past and say, "It never happened." The phrase, "who controls the past controls the future," reminds us of Amazon's and Google's devaluation and theft of every book in the world ever written, and the power that they have if they ever want to erase those books. Along with big tech, we are reminded of our news media and the gatekeepers who curate our information that they choose for us to see when we read phrases like reality control, newspeak, and doublethink. We are reminded of the media stories that provide no historical context or background when we read of the 1984 phrase memory hole, in which all history was scraped clean and rescribed exactly as often as necessary. Books were recalled and rewritten without any admission that an alteration had been made. We see this today in the politically correct revisions of our favorite books and movies. The feeling that the ongoing wars were simply false flags meant to keep the war going is encapsulated in this quote. The war was not happening. The enemy rocket bombs, which fell daily, were probably fired by the government itself, just to keep the people frightened. The totalitarian world of 1984 was, quote, "a world where firearms were completely unprocurable." In Julian Huxley's brother's book, Brave New World, by Aldous Huxley, he leaves no doubt as to who he is talking about. In his book, in chapter 1, he calls out George Bernard Shaw by name and says that he is one of the founders of the nightmare world in which they are living in. We see the takedown of old things and the disrespect for tradition and the things that brought us to where we are today. Closing museums, blowing up historical monuments, suppression of all books that are old. We have the elevation of science to godhood. What man has joined, nature is powerless to put asunder. We see everyone taking the easy way out when it comes to depression and mental problems. When the individual feels, the community reels, so a gram is better than a dam. We have the total hijacking of our minds by entertainment and amusement. Everybody is happy nowadays. Now, the old men work, the old men copulate. The old men have no time, no leisure from pleasure, not a moment to sit down and think. Safe on the solid ground of daily labor and distraction, scampering from feely to feely, from pneumatic girl to pneumatic girl, from golf course to golf course. All children were to be gotten by artificial insemination. artsem, it was called, and to be brought up in public institutions. Aldous Huxley and George Orwell knew firsthand from their interactions with Fabian socialist, power-hungry world controller wannabes that the concepts of romance, family, and self-sacrificing agape love were foreign to them, unintelligible even, and therefore they despised these concepts. Being sociopathic, and in some cases even psychopathic, the idol-pushing antichrists actually lack empathy. They cannot physically understand many human emotions, and therefore they blame these complex spiritual connections for the world's problems. Quoting from Brave New World, "Mother, monogamy, romance, high spurts the fountain, fierce and foamy the wild jet. The urge has but a single outlet, my love, my baby." No wonder these poor pre-moderns were mad and wicked and miserable. Their world didn't allow them to take things easily, didn't allow them to be sane, virtuous, happy. What with mothers and lovers? How could they be stable? Huxley saw the day that they would do away with motherhood, which would become a smutty word. He saw a time would come when college students would no longer know what a home even was. Mother, monogamy, and romance are blamed for misery, wickedness, and instability. If only man could have a sexual partner whenever he wanted, then everything would be all right. Huxley predicts the masculinization of women in order to make them more like men sexually and more available to men. In the book, so-called free martins are born sterile so that they don't have to put up with the nuisance of fertility. We see this in our world today, with propaganda being pushed to convince girls that promiscuity and overtime at work are somehow liberating, as if this is not a con job by men who simply want to sleep with more women and have both family members paying taxes. We see the idea of promiscuity being pushed as something that is healthy. In Brave New World, quote, "Everyone belongs to everyone else, and promiscuity is a citizen's duty." Huxley even reveals the idea that the sexualization of kindergarten children was one of their plans from the beginning. The world controllers think that a world without morals, and a world without religion, and a world without freedom will be much more stable. Stability is their goal. Quote, "No civilization without social stability. No social stability without individual stability. Children must be mass-produced to become obedient." In Chapter 1, Orwell describes perfectly the world in which we live in, where everything is watched and scrutinized. He says, quote, "The telescreen could be dimmed, but there was no way of turning it off completely. There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. You had to live in the assumption that every sound you made, every movement, was scrutinized. End quote. Doesn't this remind us of the 24-hour surveillance in cities across England, of the iPhone that is always listening, and of the Google locators in our vehicles, the Alexa, which has been used by courts to solve crimes by going back in time and listening to everybody's conversation in the house, the Amazon Nest, which is easily hacked, the hidden cameras that are inside people's furniture, and the Facebook camera with voice bias that knows who you are and focuses on your voice when you speak and follows you throughout the room. Orwell thought this would happen only through the most brutal and violent means. However, we've seen people line up for these devices, which we now know from slides like this one from Edward Snowden, that each one of these big tech corporations has been cajoled by the government to give them all the information about us. Every email that we write, sometimes in live time, every conversation that we have is stored in a database by our own National Security Agency. One character talks about political correctness and the power of hijacking language. He says, "It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words. Newspeak is the only language whose vocabulary gets smaller every year, and the range of consciousness gets smaller along with it, as people are afraid to say things or use words. They will say less things and use their freedom of speech a lot less often." Self-censoring is a great start, but the world controllers know that true conquest is only achieved when they have control of your mind. 1984 says that the essential crime that contained all others in itself was thought crime. They suggest that the mind should develop a blind spot whenever a dangerous thought presents itself, and that this process should be automatic and instinctive. You might argue that there's no such thing as thought crime, and there would be no way of enforcing it. After all, who could possibly be reading your thoughts? I would argue that in recent years, the goal of having thought control enforced by thought police has made great leaps forward by passing laws against hate speech and hate crimes. These terms sound like they came right off the pages of 1984, but are not in the book. They refer to real laws that have devastating consequences on our actions and free speech. Breaking the rules against hate speech can get you demonetized, banned, deplatformed, even depersoned and fired from your job. Committing a hate crime will get you double, triple, or even 10 times the normal sentence for assault or murder. Hate speech and hate crime judgments assume that the prosecuting party not only knows your actions and intentions, but also knows your motivations and thoughts while doing the action. Proving a hate crime is proving racism, something that only exists deep inside of a person's thoughts. The idol pusher's mission to wage anti-racism means that the politically correct culture cancels all meaningful dialogue, all comedy, all honesty and individuality. At its heart, it is one more way to mix all the beautiful colors and cultures in the world into one gray sameness that is easy to control. And once again, we can see the mission of the idol pushers to control our thoughts, to get inside our heads, as one more example of them wanting to usurp God's throne and become God themselves. We know from the Bible that only God can judge the heart, only God can read our thoughts. But as usual, they want to do what only God can do. Soon it will be through their technology that they will read our thoughts. But it will not just be reading our thoughts, but controlling them as well. You might be saying to yourself, they can never conquer my mind. They can never convince me to love their big brother control system. But Orwell seems to disagree in his book 1984. The main character tries his best to withstand them, but in the end, he betrays his first love, and, when given his freedom again, and is on the outside watching Big Brother in a cafe, he looks at the screen and says, quote, he had won the victory over himself. He loved Big Brother. In this author's opinion, they already have control over our actions. They have much control over our speech, and they are now trying to control our minds. Why do they need this control so badly? It is because they need to make their point of view become a religion to the rest of us. Our religion must become consumerism. Our creed must be eugenics, population control, and the Green Revolution. We must religiously want to save the earth. Our creed must be smart technology, controlling every aspect of your life. Our philosophy must be one of following artificial intelligence and bowing down to science. In their words, they must, quote, take the techniques of persuasion and information and true propaganda that they have learned to apply nationally in war and deliberately bend them to the international tasks of peace. If necessary, utilizing them as Lenin envisaged, to, quote, overcome the resistance of millions to desirable change, using drama to reveal reality in art, and aiming to produce that concerted effort which needs a background of faith and a sense of destiny. This must be a mass philosophy, a mass creed. End quote. In our next few sections, we will look at that mass philosophy, that mass creed, that one world religion that they have in store for their subjects, a religion of self-annihilation and submission and worship of the image of the beast. But first, we would like to look at their religion and see their belief systems and try to understand their enlightenment and their evolution into becoming gods themselves. So please join me next time, and I will show you that their rock is not our rock.